Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Speak, Film, and Enter, a podcast where we review and rank movies. I'm Nate.
And I'm Dylan.
And we have a very special episode today.
Yes.
A couple of weeks ago, Sight and Sound film magazine, I believe, through the British Film Institute, every 10 years, they release a new voting on the top 100 films of all time. And they started doing this in 1952, so they've been doing it every 10 years since then, and it's 2022, so they released this version of it. And what made this one particularly interesting was that they, I think, roughly doubled the number of people that they polled.
Interesting.
So they went from like around 800 some to over 1,600 critics and industry insiders and people from different countries, I think, were represented that hadn't been before, and obviously a bit of a younger audience and kind of group. And so Sight and Sound is kind of the closest that we have to any type of, I guess, consensus or canon on the top 100 films of all time. That's where the idea of Citizen Kane being the greatest movie of all time comes from, is the Sight and Sound poll, where even if you're not aware of it, you know, I've talked to people who kind of give me a like, isn't Citizen Kane considered like the greatest film of all time or something? And they don't really know where they necessarily got that idea from, but it's just kind of out there.
Yeah.
So as you can probably tell, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can kind of see the title of the movie that we have up on the screen here. A French movie from 1975 called Jeanne Dielman. And then the rest of the whole title is her street address. Is the new number one film of all time. It's only the fourth movie that has ever been the greatest film of all time on the Sight and Sound poll. After Bicycle Thieves, Citizen Kane, and Vertigo, which finally unseated Citizen Kane in 2012. That was a big deal.
Yep.
So Dylan and I thought it would be fun to watch this movie that we had always kind of looked at and sort of rolled our eyes at a little bit and thought, I'll probably never watch that. It's 3 hours and 21 minutes. French movie from 1975. We thought it would be fun now that it's, you know, the new number one movie of all time, to dive into it and see if we agree, if we think it's ridiculous, anywhere in between. So before we get any further along, Dylan, do you want to tell people what it's about?
Yes. And I'll read the whole title just because. Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quai de Commerce. I think that's Commerce Road, 1080 Bruxelles. So I'm guessing Brussels.
Yeah.
A lonely widowed housewife does her daily chores, takes care of her apartment where she lives with her teenage son, and turns the occasional trick to make ends meet. However, something happens that changes her safe routine.
Yeah. So I was curious to see if there's going to be anything at the end of that, because I was ready for the synopsis to be about as mundane as the rest of the movie is. And I mean, before we dive into it, I guess really quickly we can go over our thoughts on, we both looked at the poll. What did you think of it? Do you think it's valuable in any way, or do you think these things are just stupid? Kind of, where do you land on those?
I think it's valuable. I think the way that they compile the list is smart. They just have everybody fill out their top 10, and then they add all the lists together and make a top 100 out of everybody's top 10, which I think is a smart way to do it. And I mean, I definitely think it's valuable, and I think it's good because of exactly reasons like this, where a movie like this that definitely has not gotten as much attention or accolades as Citizen Kane or Vertigo or The Godfather or whatnot. I thought it was a great way for these movies like this to get attention and buzz again. And also it gave us the perfect reason to finally watch this movie. And so I don't know. I think it is valuable, and I'm definitely going to try to remember 10 years from now when the next one comes out, and we'll see if it changes. But maybe now that more and more people are seeing this, maybe it won't. Maybe it won't. Maybe Jeanne Dielman's just going to hold the number one spot for a long time now.
Maybe it's the new Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always find these interesting. I mean, I think it's valuable and interesting to know what, experts think. I know people roll their eyes at that word a lot these days, but these are people who have learned a lot about the history of cinema.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to know what they think, especially, going back. This is a movie that I would guess 999 people out of 1,000 have never even heard of,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially in the US.
Yeah, for sure.
And like you said, it finally inspired us to watch this.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, it is, I think it is interesting that there was no like Tarantino or Spielberg movie on this list. I think sometimes you can run into something with big directors like that where they have multiple movies that people might vote for. So they just kind of end up sort of canceling each other out. Like, Jaws not being on the 100 best movies of all time, or Pulp Fiction seems a
Yeah.
little ridiculous in place of some like indie art house thing from name a country
Yeah.
in like the 60s that a lot of people haven't heard of, but that doesn't make them less good just because we
Mhm.
haven't heard of them. And I guess I look at these things as a way to learn about new movies. I don't
Yep.
particularly care what's number one or what isn't. I find it interesting, but I look at this and think like, cool, I have a whole new list of supposedly great movies to pick from. Their movies on this list I think are horrible. I've seen about 45 of them.
Okay.
There are other movies on this list I think are phenomenal. So just like any other
Mhm.
list I'm going to see, I'm going to disagree with some of it and agree strongly with a lot of it. And I think we can just start this by saying I found myself almost shockingly agreeing with the sentiment that Jeanne Dielman is a great movie.
Yep, I'm with you on that. We got together and we watched it. We watched it together because it is 3.5 hours long, and from everything that you hear about it, it's very. It's just following this woman while she does her daily routine and kind of leaning into the mundane and just the like really leaning into like what her routine is, and that being the way for us to get to know her character instead of some
Yeah,
sort of exposition or her talking to someone or writing a letter. It's really just like, if you follow around somebody all day, you'll
for
probably kind of start to get them, even if they're not talking very much. Like,
yeah, we should say this takes place over the course of 3 days.
yes, it does.
And I mean, if you've heard anything about this movie, you might have just heard it as the one like, does a woman just do daily like house chores for 3.5 hours? And basically, yes.
Yeah. Yep.
She peels potatoes, she makes the bed, she cleans stuff,
Hmm.
she
Does
makes
dishes, makes
does
dinner.
dishes, prepares dinner.
Hmm.
Occasionally, she goes shopping. We do leave the apartment a couple times. We got far enough into it where we were wondering if she was ever going to leave the apartment.
Yeah,
But I
or if
felt
we
like
were gonna leave with her, or just
right.
have her leave and then cut to her coming back.
Yeah, I did expect her to leave and for us to follow her just because I feel like if she never did, I would have heard about that because I had
Mhm.
heard of this movie and nobody ever. I feel like if she never left the apartment and we never left it, that would have been something that people mentioned frequently when talking about this movie. But
Mhm. But it's mostly all in the apartment.
yeah, and
90%.
and I'd say 90% of it is just her by herself. I mean, her
Mhm.
son comes home after school and they're kind of quiet. He reads a lot.
Mhm.
They'll occasionally put on the radio. They eat dinner basically in silence.
Yep.
And this, it sounds boring. It absolutely sounds boring. And I don't blame
Mhm.
anybody for even continuing to roll their eyes at the fact that we really liked this movie.
Yep. Yep.
But, and I can almost, it's almost hard for me to fully explain why it's good because
Me
it
too.
shouldn't be by
Mhm.
really any measure. I mean, it holds the camera. The camera's still most of the time, and it just holds the frame on a lot of things that every other movie will just cut away from because it's accepted that it's boring and it's not part of the story and we don't need it. It
Yep.
does work here because that is the point of the story.
Mhm.
I still wasn't expecting it to make it any more interesting, but it
Mhm.
does. And I think
Yeah.
there are a couple reasons why. I mean, I think one of them is just the movie has kind of a vibe and a flow and a wavelength to it
Mhm.
that takes a while to get used to. But once you kind of pick up on the pacing of everything, it's sort
Yeah.
of oddly hypnotic.
Yes. Yeah, that's the word that keeps coming to mind. I think we mentioned that multiple times while we were watching it.
Yeah, like how, she just starts brushing her hair
Mm-hmm.
And basically every task in this movie that she does, you realize after about 45 minutes that you're going to watch the entire task.
Yep.
They're never going to cut away. They're not going to
Mm-hmm.
change to a different camera angle. They're not going to zoom. It's
Yep.
just going to be a still shot of this woman doing this thing. There's no score in this movie.
Nope.
So it's silent often, or you just hear whatever sort of pitter patter
Mm-hmm.
is going on in the room. And it, like, we just watched her brush her hair for 5 minutes. And after about 2 minutes of it, part of me was just kind of like, this is sort of weirdly satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Like, kind
Mm-hmm.
of the pace of what she's doing. And I like started to understand people who just say, like, yeah, I really like brushing my hair. And
Yeah.
I've never
Yeah.
understood that in my life. And I kind of started to get it, I guess. And it
Mm-hmm.
feels weird to say all of this seriously and not in a sort of mocking tone, but
Yeah.
it's effective.
Yeah. When we were watching it, we started out. I mean, the first like half hour to 40 minutes. I mean, we were cracking a lot of jokes that were kind of like mocking the idea, like, oh God, here we,
Mm-hmm.
she's doing the dishes. We're gonna watch every single one of these dishes. But then that turned into genuine, like, I was actually like very kind of enthralled.
And
Like,
invested. Yeah.
yeah, and especially like, yeah, when she was at part where she makes meatloaf and just watching her make
That was
the
my favorite scene in
meatloaf.
the entire movie. I think
Yeah.
this movie may have, I may have started developing like multiple fetishes after watching this movie. It's such a weird thing where, like, yeah, we're watching her make meatloaf, and after like 30 seconds of it, I'm watching him just kind of like, yeah, get your hands in there. Like,
Yeah.
it's so weird. And
Like, oh, that looks good. Like, I hope your son appreciates this.
that's
Like,
another thing too, is we'll get to him later.
mhm.
But there's just something that cannot be fully understood until you watch this movie
Yeah.
about the way that it's done. And it's definitely one of those things where, you and I have gone through lots of movies in the Criterion collection the last couple of years after we started doing this.
Yep.
And I've kind of reached a point where I can often tell within like 10, 15 minutes if a movie is like really, really well made.
Yeah.
There are
It's
certain like sometimes with a movie, like Portrait of a Lady on Fire is one of the first ones that comes to mind, where
mhm.
sometimes when there's like nothing really happening, like in
Yeah.
that movie, like there's a scene where it's hard for her to get to shore, and then she just gets there in the middle of the night, and she's kind of wet, and then she's just like sitting by the fire with a stranger having a
Yeah.
drink, and they're not speaking, and that's like 7 minutes into the movie, and that was the moment with Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I was like, oh shit, I think the director has this on lock. Like, I think
Yeah.
she just nailed everything, and I'm excited to continue. And that's what happened with this,
Mhm.
where after about half an hour, I was just like, okay, I get what they're doing here. And
Mhm.
I think it's going to be effective. And it is. It's like we've
Yeah.
mentioned the length multiple times. I've watched many movies that are 2 hours and 45 minutes plus that I've found way less interesting than this.
Yeah, I've watched movies that are that long where a lot of stuff happens, like
Yeah.
plot-wise, and
Hmm.
it still is more boring than this movie was.
Yeah.
Like, because it's this weird effect, and I agree that it's hard to describe what it is about it that makes it good, because I tried over the weekend, we watched on Friday. I tried
Yeah.
multiple times to explain to somebody like what
Mhm.
the movie was and like how it was actually good and it works, but it just feels, you just can't really put it into words. It's
It
like
feels insufficient.
it feels, yeah, it's like the by by embracing kind of the voyeuristic nature and just being like, you're a fly on the wall and you're just going to watch this lady do her chores and go through her routine and that's it. Like, after a while you start to, the level of detail that you start to pick up on is crazy, and it's like, it's not in the same way that other like older movies that we've watched are extremely detailed and it's like, oh man, like, that was really really well done and put together and everything. With this one, it was just like the details of like everyday life and just kind of like the little things that you can't, like you wouldn't think would be dramatic, but they are. Like, every morning she has to get up and she shines her son's shoes like before he's even awake. And then there's one morning where she, like, the brush slips and she drops it and she has to like stop and go pick it up. And even that seemed like, oh man, she's off her game today. Like, and it
Yeah.
was like, and that's
You
so
read
weird. Like,
Yeah, or when I think you and I both gasped when she like nudged the jar of milk
mm-hmm.
and like almost knocked it over.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what she was doing, but it like sort of teeters a little bit. Went, oh,
Mm-hmm.
and I, it's odd. This movie basically pulls off a magic trick,
Yeah.
and
It
it,
like the way I said it when that milk, it was like I felt like the way I feel in real life when I almost tip over a glass of milk, but I catch it.
yep,
Because it's not that that tipping would be really that dramatic or horrible. It's just like the tediousness of like, oh God, like then I'd have to go and get a rag and I'd have to clean up all the milk and I'd
and
have
then the
to,
milk's gone.
and then the milk is gone and then it's right. And then, but because you're like sitting on her shoulder this whole time, you pick up on that stuff from her perspective where you're like, yeah, that would have, if she would have spilled that milk, we would have had to watch her clean it all up. And then she would have been running late on her daily routine, or like when she, she gets up in the morning one morning and she opens up the window because there's birds chirping outside, but then she leaves without shutting the window. And because you've been there with her this whole time, you notice immediately, like, oh, she forgot to shut the window. Or like, there's a big
Yeah,
deal about they shut off the lights in every room, her and her son, that they
on a
leave because they're
strict budget.
strict budget, and I love how that is also shown, not told. And
Yes.
I mean, pretty much everything in this movie is shown, not told, for the most part.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, even that, like, it's just incredible how um it's just incredible how it sucks you in, and then all of a sudden you're just so attuned, you're just in tune with that apartment and her life just from watching her do these things. It's hard to describe, and I can't think of any movie quite like it that does it, because
It's
there's definitely a way where a movie could attempt to do it and it would actually just be boring and
yeah,
like
for sure.
terrible.
It's almost like I guess one way I've tried to describe it is like if you only listen to like really fast paced, like up tempo music,
Hmm.
and then somebody plays you something that's operating at like a much slower pace. And at
Okay.
first, you're just kind of like antsy for like the beat to pick up, or like you're just kind of waiting for it to be like everything else that you're used to.
Yeah.
And then this movie is like eventually it's like you took an edible or something and then got on the wavelength of that song. And all of a
Yep.
sudden you're just like on the couch and you only want to experience it at this pace.
Yep.
And then every time she does something slightly off, it's like throwing off your vibe.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you're just like, it's like somebody's knocking on the door or like somebody's phone buzzes when you're just like trying to kind of chill.
Yeah, you
And
notice it
it pulls you
immediately.
out. Yeah. And
Mhm.
that doesn't fully sink in until you get on the wavelength of this movie. But then, and to kind of go back to your point about like the milk, it's specifically because you know that you're going to watch every task that the milk potentially being knocked over is a big deal because you're going to experience the whole like shit, I got to do this whole extra thing now with
Mhm.
her.
Mhm.
And that could be a bad thing, and it almost should be a bad thing in a movie to feel like shit, now we got to like experience this whole thing with the everything we're describing again sounds like, oh damn, now they have this like bad scene that they had to add because of the like premise of the movie,
Mhm.
but it somehow works. And I'm going to keep saying it somehow works over and over again
Yeah.
because that's just kind of the best way I can describe this.
Yeah, like the word mundane turned into a positive like
Right.
adjective for a movie.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah,
that's
this movie.
I've never felt that before. I kept
Mhm.
telling people like, yeah, it's very mundane, but in a good way. And they were just like,
Right. And that's
it sounds
never a good
awful. So
thing.
many people were like, that sounds awful. I'm like,
Right.
you would think, but
Yeah, that's why
actually,
I keep having to go back to that. Like everything we described doesn't sound interesting unless you've actually seen this and you fully understand what we're talking about. And it's
it,
again, I just keep going back to this movie pulls off a magic trick that I don't quite understand.
it leads to this connection with the main character that is
Yeah.
really unlike any other movie I've seen before, where it's like
Hmm.
you don't feel the connection with them because of like the writing, and because of what they've done or what their opinions are or what they've been through, you just feel this connection because you're just there with her
Mm-hmm.
all day. You're like, it really puts you in her head, and then you start to just appreciate like every little thing that anytime that she can get a moment that is actually like good for her, you appreciate it so much more. Like when there's like 5 minutes where she actually reads a magazine and listens to like this classical music that she likes. It's like, oh, like, like, I'm so happy you got to have that moment, Jeanne. Like, you deserved
Right.
it. Like,
Yeah.
I've seen everything you've done today. You're not getting appreciated. You're putting in the work just by yourself, and now you get this one moment after dinner to listen to this song you like, and like, I feel that. Like,
Yeah,
like,
for
you
sure.
deserve this. Like,
Yeah, especially because her son just like doesn't really pay attention to or appreciate her at all, which kind of leads me into something I wanted to talk about that
yeah,
you and I sort of agreed on. We basically think that this should be required viewing for every man or boy over the age of like 10 on every Mother's Day.
yep,
I think
yep,
the mom should get to like go to the spa, like a
mm-hmm,
6-hour spa day that the men have paid for. And
yep.
in the 6 hours that she's gone, you got to watch this movie, clean the house, and have dinner ready before she gets back.
Amen. That should
Yeah.
be the American Mother's Day tradition, because
Hmm.
yeah, this really, I don't see how you could possibly watch this and not like become kind of a feminist. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Or just like
definitely,
feel a little guilty about any time you've just been like, Mom, is the food ready?
yeah, or get home and you're like, "Oh, this is for dinner." And you're like, "Oh." Like
Yeah.
any time, any
Hmm.
single time
Yeah.
where I didn't appreciate, and that's, yeah, this movie pulls that off. And then also just the way it's shot, like the framing and everything, the way that the apartment looks, the things that they do with the editing, staying in the room until she turns the lights off. Even when she leaves the frame, we stay in the
Yep.
room until she turns the lights off. The sign across the street, that's kind of the neon that's coming into their living room, where it's just kind of this repetitive, it looks like it's like a, some casino or hotel or some big neon sign that just
Yeah.
like has this repetitive kind of pattern. And when the lights are off in the living room, you see it very clearly. And when the lights are on, you kind of see it on some of the glass surfaces. But like, it's all those little touches that just like they nail the feel of it, and to the point where you recognize the wallpaper and you recognize the furniture, and then even the bed, the like futon bed that her son sleeps on in the living
Oh,
room, when it unfolds and then when it refolds in, there's something so like like, I don't even know the
yeah.
word, like
Weirdly satisfying about it.
weirdly satisfying about it. Like, and then she puts the living room back together, and then it's like, all right, this chore is done. Living room looks nice, Jeanne. Like,
Yeah.
good job.
Yeah,
Like,
we were watching this, and the first morning when the first time she folds that couch back up, and it does it in this like really cool way
yeah.
where it just kind of comes back together like sort of from like the outside in from the
Hmm.
bottom and the top. And I was just like, that was cool. And you just turned and looked at me and said, we're gonna get to watch that 2 more times.
Yeah. And then the next day when she goes to do it, it like gets stuck on something, and it's like, oh no.
I
Like
was
she
so I was so disappointed. I was like, is it broken? Do I
I,
not get to watch this thing fold in on itself again?
right? Like,
It's yeah, it's odd how invested I became in every little detail of this woman's house and this woman's life. And
mhm.
specifically, we did talk about what our favorite chores were to watch Jeanne do.
Yes, yes.
So number one for me was definitely the meatloaf.
Yeah, I saw your review on Letterboxd, and I agree with your four number ones, so you can just let it rip. Yeah, the meatloaf was just an experience unlike any other. That's one of the scenes where I was like, you know what? Because we were talking like, okay, this would be, imagine watching this in a theater where you can't talk. Because I mean,
Yeah,
me and you, we were talking a lot because it's like, okay, here's another 5 minute scene where she's gonna do all the laundry, so we can, talk a little bit while we watch. But sitting in a theater and watching the whole thing and not being able to talk, like, that would be quite the undertaking. However, I
for
wish I could
sure.
see the meatloaf scene on the big screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Like really gets her fingers in there.
Yeah.
So for me, it was the meatloaf was number one. Number two was the folding up of couch.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Mm-hmm.
incredible.
Yep.
Number 3 was I think I had when she brushes her hair.
Yep.
It's
Yeah.
just incredibly satisfying to watch her do that.
Mm-hmm.
And because we talked about while we were watching it how we became very entranced. I think that was the first moment where we like really got into the pace of the movie
Mm-hmm.
and kind of enjoyed watching an entire task because she'd brush it down and then it would look different a little bit every time she did it.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I was just like,
Sometimes it
I
would
could watch.
bounce. Sometimes it would bounce right back. Sometimes it would kind of stay down. Sometimes she'd kind of fluff it, and it was just mesmerizing. It was just like
Yeah,
I can't look
it
away.
was. And I was like, she stopped doing it, and I turned to you and I said, I could have watched her do that for another 15 minutes easily.
Yep.
Like when you get kind of weirdly into just watching like a screensaver, like on something that moves or something, and you just kind
Mm-hmm.
of like fall into the pattern of it. And
Mm-hmm.
then number 4 was doing the dishes,
Yes.
which
Yes.
they filmed this from a very interesting angle. It was from behind her. So
Mm-hmm.
you could see her back, and then you could see the strainer,
Mm-hmm.
where she'd put all the ones she had cleaned. But
Yeah,
because of
like
the
the
way they
rack,
filmed it, the what?
the dish rack.
The dish
Yeah,
rack,
where you
yeah.
put yeah
But
to
because
dry.
like you couldn't see the sink, so you couldn't see how much she still had left to do. So it kind of like forced you to just intently watch all of it. And
Mm-hmm.
then where we talk about like the attention to detail and how she slowly starts to kind of unravel a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. Like this is something that I noticed right away where I think on day 2, maybe day
Yeah,
3,
2 or 3.
she puts one of the dishes in the rack and it's still soapy. And I was like, "Hey, wait a minute. That she didn't like that's not done." And then
Yeah,
she washes the next one and she puts it there and it's correct. And then she notices that the other one is still soapy and she grabs that and then
washes it
rinses that
again.
off, washes it
Yeah.
again, and then puts it back. But there's so many things that I was like, "Hey, did she forget to what?" And then like
Yep.
2 minutes later, she'll be like, "Oh, I forgot to turn the light off," or "Oops, the dish," or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's kind of satisfying to pick up on these things before she does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, like, we don't. She kind of unravels, and her daily routine, it keeps getting kind of disrupted, kind of thrown off balance. It's all these little things. She leaves the lights on. She leaves the window open. She forgets. She boils the potatoes too long, or what? All
Yeah.
these little things. But we notice them by the end. You notice them immediately, and that and then to go in with that is this performance, which I think we should touch on before we wrap
Yes.
up here. She is on screen. I think I saw like 95% of the movie. I mean, it's a lot. It's basically always her. And for the first day, because she's executing her routine and she's on her game, you don't get a lot of her face is usually very expressionless. She is when she talks with her son, it's kind of quick 1 or 2 sentence conversations and then back to silence. And it
Yep.
seems like, okay, like she's very calm and in the zone. And then the second day, there's just little facial expressions when things start to inconvenience her. That's like, oh yeah, she's a little aggravated at that. Like, oh,
Right.
that's, I can see that's bugging her. And then by the third day, it's not like she completely goes off the rails, but it's just like even more, she's getting frustrated and the look on her face isn't just kind of plain and mundane. It's kind of it's just little expressions of just like or like a little eye roll or like a little or just the way that she's shining the shoes is a little more aggressive and a little more
Yep.
haphazard, a little more like, I'm so sick of doing this. And it's just such a subtle performance that is just I was since I've been thinking about it more since we watched it, I've just grown more appreciation for it because it really
Absolutely.
it could have been done so heavy-handedly and just where it wouldn't have this movie could have been done so poorly in so many ways.
It probably has been.
It probably has been, right, by movies that didn't make their
Yeah.
mark in any sort of history and were quickly forgotten because they're like, nope, universally boring. And then comes this one that's like, oh yeah, it is boring in like a great way. Like it's mundane
Yeah.
is its excellence, and
Mhm.
it's really hard to describe. But I just thought she did such a good job. The Delphine Seyrig is her
Okay.
name,
Yeah.
and wow, I
Did you know
mean,
that the
just
woman who directed this was 25?
wow.
Yeah.
That's really surprising because I feel like it's so accurately depicting like an older woman who's kind of, trapped by society's expectations and trapped by what her role is supposed to be. And so it's impressive that the
Yeah,
director
she
and writer
based
was
it
only
on, like,
25.
mostly her aunt, I think. I think she lived with her mom and her aunt, and
Okay.
she just kinda based it on, like, her observations of just, like, watching them, like, nonstop do these things to just, like, keep the household running.
Yeah.
Chantel Ackerman is her name. So,
Mhm.
yeah, really, really fascinating, and, you got anything else, or do you, wanna get into the stars?
I guess the last thing I was going to say is, I think there's definitely a lot of people out there who are never going to like this movie and never going to
Yeah.
really give it a chance. And I totally get that. But I will say, if you're someone who appreciates slow burns and you can commit to the long haul, I think it definitely does pay off. And once it kind of seeps in and you get the pacing and what's going on, it really is a unique experience. And I also think there are people who say that, I like doing the dishes because I can kind of zen out and just kind of do this task or doing
Mhm.
laundry or whatever it is. There's people who really enjoy like, doing chores, put some music in, you're just kind of cruising. And this movie somehow like captures that feeling, which I didn't think a movie really ever would be able to as effectively as this.
Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
all right, but yeah, we can get to the stars.
All right. We will be back in just a few seconds with our star rating.
All right.
Okay.
I can go first.
All right.
So I've thought about this a lot, and right now I am giving this a very strong 4 stars. I think this movie is great. I think it is a great movie. I totally get it why it was number one. Like that's the biggest thing, and that's what I think both
Yeah.
me and you said we went to. What we wanted to just be able to get it, and I
Yeah.
feel like I 100% do. And explaining it to other people and seeing the looks on their face of dismay of like I would never watch that. It pains me a little bit because it's like no, actually, this
Right.
is a really good movie. Like you just please believe me. Like you don't like you know.
Mhm.
Um, but it's kind of like it's kind of like putting together like a 5,000 piece like jigsaw puzzle, and it's like oh my god, that's gonna be so boring. It's like no, but once you're on a roll, like there's
I
nothing
would
like.
Yeah, one thing I meant to bring up earlier is for somebody thinking of maybe watching this, and sometimes I know it can be appealing because you can pause stuff and it would maybe be appealing or somebody thinking like, oh, it's 3 hours and 21 minutes. I can watch this. I can treat it like a mini series or something and watch like an hour a day. I
Yeah.
really think you're gonna kind of lose the thread
Mm-hmm.
of this movie if you do that. Even though it is like 3 separate days of doing the same shit over and over again, I think there's just a wavelength that this movie operates on that if you stop watching it and then try to come back, you're going to pull yourself out of that. And then it is going to
Mm-hmm.
feel boring.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah,
I
I'm
think
right there with you where
I think that's fair.
we started it and we said my hope was just that I would get it
Mm-hmm.
because there are movies in the Sight and Sound Top 100 that I think are horrible. And there are a couple of the ones that I think are horrible that I guess I kind of get. And
Mm-hmm.
there's at least one of them that I will never in my life understand the universal praise
Which
for
one is
this
that?
movie. It's The Night of the Hunter.
Oh yes. Okay. Yeah.
I absolutely will never understand the number of like amazing directors and just highly respected and like knowledgeable, like people way more knowledgeable about the history of cinema and like what makes a good movie than I am. I will never understand what that movie is doing anywhere with any kind of positive rating.
Yeah.
And then there are other ones on there that I don't like that I'm at least like, okay, I can see some, like if you're really into this or that, like I guess I can see it, but I kind of hate it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
we both luckily
Yeah.
agreed that we get it and we really like this movie. Did you have anything else, or could
The
I
last
guess I
thing I was
sort
going to
of
say is the ending,
stepped
which
on
we
your
didn't
toes
want.
a little bit there?
No, that's totally fine. The other than that, I just want to say, the ending, which we've decided we weren't going to talk about. We don't want to spoil it. Certainly, if you are committed to giving this a shot, we don't want to ruin the end of a 3.5
Yeah,
hour movie. But the ending has sat better and better with me the more that I have gotten away from
same.
it. I think when it happened at first, it felt a little bit like maybe it didn't fit, or it was just like, oh, okay, that's. But now that I've gotten away from it, I actually think that it really does pull it off, and just
Yeah.
certain shots and certain moments of the ending I thought were really, really well done. And now talking about it with you and what makes the movie so good, I think the ending fits even better. So it's definitely a 4 for me. I could see it going up in the future. Just maybe the further I get away, if I keep thinking about it, then like, okay, I might have to bump it up. Hard to say if I'll ever watch it again, but
Sure.
under
I
the right
feel like the fact
circumstance.
that both of us are like not just immediately ruling it out as maybe I'll watch this again someday.
Yeah.
That in itself is impressive.
It is. It is. So yeah, I'm going to give it a 4 stars. I thought this was great. I'm really glad that we finally watched it, and I understand why it is number 1 on the Sight and Sound poll.
Yeah. I'm going to go a little higher than you. I'm giving this a 4.5. It is the first movie I have watched all year, I think, to crack my personal top 100.
Wow. Yeah, all year. Jeez.
Yeah. It's just been sitting there for
Mm-hmm.
untouched. I've got it at 99. And
Nice.
the reason I've got it all the way into my top 100 is not necessarily because it's one of the 100 most like entertaining things I've ever watched.
Yeah.
But the fact that I found this is one of the most impressive movies I've ever seen. I would put this in like the top 10 to 20 of just things that are like with how well it's made. Like this,
yeah, like craftsmanship.
absolutely, yes, 100% has no business working.
Yeah.
And the fact that I found it as captivating as I did, I find beyond impressive.
Mm-hmm.
And just, we watched this 3 days ago, and my respect for it and my admiration for it, and even like just looking back, my enjoyment of it has gone up in the 72 hours since we watched this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it is 3 hours and 20 minutes of a woman doing chores, and I actually think I'll probably watch this again someday.
Yeah.
Like all of those things added together, this movie is fantastic, and I totally get it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's the greatest movie ever made or anything, but I definitely think it's good enough to be up there and not get an eye roll from me. I think it absolutely belongs in the top 100, probably in the top half. And yeah, that is way more positive than I was ever expecting to be on this movie.
Agreed. Yeah, this was a good experience. I'm glad that the Sight and Sound poll, instigated us finally watching it, because if it hadn't been on there, there's a good chance that it would always just be one of those Criterion ones that we see it, we joke about, we're gonna get together and watch this French movie now? No, not today. Yep. And then that would just be for all time, and we'd never actually sit down and watch it. We'd just look at it as like, I'm sure it's good, but it's super artsy, and I'm not in the mood. And I'm really glad that we committed.
Here's a perfect example for me. I have a list on Letterboxd titled Long Ass Movies I Keep Meaning to Watch. And I did not put this movie on that list.
Yeah.
I looked at it and I just thought, like, I'm never going to watch this.
Yeah.
It's just I just need to be honest with myself. It's never going to happen. And then if this was number 2, I don't think we would have watched this.
No.
And I'm really glad that it came in at number 1, because it's really, really good. And so, yeah, I mean, I had basically anything that was over like 245 that I've just always kind of felt like I should really watch that, but I could just watch like 2 other movies instead, basically. Yep. I put on that list, and it has about 30 movies on it. And the fact that I didn't even bother to put Jeanne Dielman on it because I was so sure I'd never. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, it is. We here at the Speak Film and Enter podcast gives it the stamp of approval.
Absolutely.
And for all the people out there that there's some people got real upset. It seemed like
Paul Schrader's one of them.
They took it real personal, like it being number 1 means you can't watch Citizen Kane ever again, or
some idea that this is like some man behind the curtain with some agenda of like wokeness.
Yeah,
this is like 1,600 people who each just submitted their top 10.
Yeah,
there's no
they didn't coordinate, and similar to we did our collective we ranked the Spielberg movies, and because we combined our list, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade actually ended up being higher than it probably would have, just because it was always like number 3 or number 4 or number 5 for all of us. So because it was up there, it elevated it. And I'm sure that's what happened here. I don't think that 1,600 people all had Jeanne Dielman at number 1, but a bunch of them probably had it in the mix. And then when you add that up at the end, oh, look at that. there's Jeanne Dielman. So
It's also
I don't know
something I
why
think
people are taking it
where,
so personally.
yeah, I also think it's something where there's really not anything else like it. And
Yeah.
it's sort of like also a stand-in while being just great on its own, kind of a stand-in to like represent an entire subgenre of like cinema history that's kind of been overlooked.
Yeah.
And so I think I think you get a lot of that with people just like, well, I got to put something like this in the top 10 and Jeanne Dielman's the best one.
Hmm.
So there. Whereas
Something
something
that
like,
kind of, yeah, is
there's no
subversive of
Jaws.
the typical film structure. It's so
Right.
different. It's so like an anti-movie almost.
Yeah,
Like,
right. We're like something like there's no Spielberg or Tarantino movie, but a lot of people might have different favorites from those directors and
mhm,
end up just kind of like, you end up with like 10 votes for Jaws and 9 for Saving Private Ryan and 11 for Schindler's List instead of just
mhm.
like 35 for Jaws
Yeah.
or,
Yep. Yeah, no, fantastic. I mean, yeah, I think that's actually a funny juxtaposition. This movie and Jaws, like
yeah.
total ends of the spectrum, but they're both fantastic. There's room for both at this
Did they come
podcast.
out the same year? I think they did.
75?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, how about that? There'd be
Totally
a.
did that on accident, but there you go.
All right. Well, this was a great time. I'm glad that we reviewed it.
Yeah.
Shout out to the Sight and Sound people for opening our eyes to this movie. And now we get to spend the rest of our life trying to figure out the way to explain what makes it good.
And
Maybe,
being like the only people we know who have seen it.
yep. that's our lot in life now.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah,
all
you're the
right.
guys who
Well,
watch Jeanne Dielman.
yeah.
Like
Oh
that's gonna
God.
be like like when people forget our names at like mutual friends at a party.
Mm-hmm.
Like which one was Nate and Dylan? Like they're the two guys that watched that weird French movie. Like, oh, those
Eventually,
two.
it's gonna be like, oh God, don't get him started on Jeanne Dielman.
Never gonna shut up about it.
Nope.
All
All
right.
right. Well, this was fun. I
Yeah,
believe, is it your turn to put a wrap on the show?
it is.
All right, go for it.
Wednesdays, it's breaded veal with peas and carrots.